for instance, want to do MATLAB, and it doesn't seem that it has that. Oh, that's bad. Let me check here.
But you can also share your whole screen, not only your presentation.
Okay. Yeah.
It's better.
I wonder where that option is. Is it this here? Let's see. Okay, I'd like to record this. I think this is stopped. I don't know.
Well, for me, when I click on the button Share Screen, I have several options to choose.
Yeah.
Or the windows, and I can also choose.
Okay. Maybe that's what it is, right? Do you not see my? You probably now see, for instance, if I go here, do you see a MATLAB window?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay. So this is what it is. So this is what I'll use. Then I can just switch it within my system.
Yes.
Okay. I see. Yeah.
Now
that's
you
good.
can switch from one.
Now, for instance, I can show a web page.
Yeah.
Like this web page here. Okay, that sounds good. So let me stop this for a moment. Okay. So I had, because of my talk is very theoretical or more theoretical, I had wanted to respond to questions more quickly. That is, while I'm talking, make a break occasionally and look at the questions. I guess I could do that by just bringing the YouTube into the foreground, or if you, I don't know, if you or one of your students keeps copying it to.
Yeah, I can keep copying to you.
But then the problem is if I open chats, then I guess everyone sees the chat window, right?
Yes.
It's maybe not so ideal. So what if I just go to YouTube and just then they see them? It's a loop, right? But it doesn't matter. It's just a loop, and then I would just try to read any questions in YouTube. I mean, there's a delay, so it will still be delayed. Okay, so yeah, that's more realistic because I don't think I can read the chat message while I'm sharing my screen.
Okay, so it seems to work.
Yeah.
Right, Liz? I don't think I can read the chat messages while I'm sharing my screen, right?
No, you can let both windows open, but then then your presentation will be quite smaller for the
no. So I will just try to have a quick peek at YouTube occasionally and see if there's something. And I would also encourage you or Mark, if questions come up that seem like questions that I should answer, before going to the end, just a question of understanding. You can just tell me, auditorily.
Okay. Yeah. All right, I'll do that. So, yeah. Sure.
Yeah, it makes it a little more interactive. And I'm fear that if I say something people don't understand, but the questions to me are often more questions of understanding, not so much really scientific, deeper questions. And then it is awkward if I have to answer them much later.
I usually copy all the questions because I make a file with all the questions. Yeah. So I will keep. My students will still send me all the questions, and I will repost to you in the chat.
Yeah.
But if you look at,
and that's still great. At the end, I will still try to answer all of those.
Yes.
But if there are any urgent questions, that are more of understanding, I will try to react to those if I can.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay, so an update. I got positive responses from so far 3 participants for the second edition of summer school if we decide to run it in the first half of June. So Monica Perez, CJ Heckman, and Richard Nichols for it. I haven't yet heard from a few others who I contacted. Well, something is, someone has YouTube, maybe microphone on or something else. So if
YouTube
you
isn't running.
can turn then it sounds like from a barrel.
Test mic, testing 1, 2, 3.
Okay, all right. So we have what, 5 minutes? Good. So far, so good.
Yeah, I thought for the
Testing
next
mic,
week,
1, 2,
a kind of
3.
a open-ended questions session.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Tuesday, on Tuesday, we had a small discussion. Next Tuesday, to have a general open-ended discussion. I'm going to encourage all the passive participants, to write questions or to prepare questions,
Yes.
and then to submit them by chat
Yeah.
to any of the speakers, and they may be general or they may be specific, whatever they want. Or they can be for everybody, whoever wants to respond. So just like the happy hour at the end of the day during summer school.
Nice, nice.
Okay. So I'll be back in a second.
It doesn't matter. We're in the call.
Gregor, can you see the streaming at YouTube? You know, on YouTube.
Yeah, I see the streaming.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Hi, John.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, you know, yesterday was so well. It's weird. It was weird because I was teaching, giving a lecture, and suddenly almost 20, 30 people just enter into the Zoom room, and they start pitching, they invaded the screen, they start to draw things.
Okay.
So I had, so that's
Yeah,
why.
that's I've heard stories like that. People try to, if it's open and they just get the link from someone, then they can do that and amuse themselves. We have had a real catastrophe here at the Ruhr University that the administration of the university has a couple of Windows-based servers, and we got attacked by the Emotet virus, you know, these that encrypt the data and try to blackmail the university. It doesn't affect any of the researchers because none of us uses Windows, but it has shut down our administration pretty much completely. So
Isn't it good when the administration is shut down?
Well, except they have to pay us and pay our bills.
Detail.
Well, two Richards, Richard Nichols and Richard Van Emmerich. I sent you invitations about the second batch of talks in the first half of June. Are you interested? Available? Okay,
Absolutely.
Richard Nichols. Yes, and what about you? Good?
Yes.
All right, so we have already 4 speakers confirmed. So Monica Perez and CJ Heckman also responded positively. So I'm waiting from Matt Trash as a potential speaker, and I forgot who else. I sent to 6 people, I believe.
What do you want us to talk about, Mark?
Well, about me and the equilibrium point hypothesis.
Uh-oh.
When is this going to be?
Luis suggested to begin on June the 2nd. I'm not sure what June the 2nd is. It may be, it's like a 2-week break or something like that.
And we will have the same amount of time, like.
I'm sorry?
So we will have the same setup as the current ones.
I guess so. Well, I wouldn't fix it because it seems to work so far. So we'll have a similar setup. You'll have similar time, everything. So you know how it will work or not work. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, and most of people, they got used to. They know that every Tuesday and every Saturday lunchtime they have something else to watch while they have lunch.
Or dinner.
Yeah, or dinner. Yes, lunch or dinner.
Breakfast?
Okay, Marco.
Oh, breakfast.
Good morning. Morning, everyone. Good afternoon, Gregor.
It's good afternoon. It's good evening in the Netherlands. I assume in Germany. So
Oh, you
we'll
know,
see.
we reach more than 1,000 people subscribe it.
Wow. That's big.
Well, that's very good. That's, I mean, maybe it's too good. It's time when we want to talk about anything, nobody cares because they all know, they all heard.
Exactly.
But I see on YouTube that we are live, so probably
We shouldn't say this.
everybody can hear us now.
But you know something that I still missing. There are so few people from Africa. I don't know how exactly we can reach people in Africa, or the researchers in Africa.
Well, let it be our biggest problem.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll. What about Micronesia?
Luis, can you make sure to send me the list of the participants for each of the
I
talks?
will send you the update list for sure.
Yeah, because then we'll have to merge all the lists.
Richard
This is gonna be a lot of
Nichols,
work.
Richard, could you check with Timko whether he would be interested
With whom?
in being one of speakers? Timko. Tim. Co.
Oh, Tim Cope. Sure,
Yeah.
I'll ask him.
Ask him whether he would be interested because I remember he presented and it was fun. When he
Yeah, he's
presented
always fun.
some years ago. Yeah. All right. Okay, Luis, let me know if we are ready.
Well, we are.
Are we?
Yes.
We are. Okay. All right. So welcome everybody to the sixth session of the Virtual Motor Control School. A couple of announcements. Announcement number 1. After the final talk this Saturday, we are going to have next Tuesday a general discussion session. So during this session, all the participants will submit questions to any of the speakers or open-ended questions to anybody. This may be theoretical questions, practical questions, questions about your personal projects, anything you wish. And the speakers of this particular edition of the school will try to respond. And I hope that most speakers will be there. All right. So, and announcement number 2 is that it's quite possible that after 2-week break, we are going to have second batch of talks in this virtual motor control summer school. You will be informed by Machizuki-sensei over the available means of communication. So don't forget to check your email. All right? Okay, and now, of course, our speaker today is Gregor Schöner. I think I say at the beginning of the talk, I say about every speaker that he's been a great friend for the past 30 years or so. So this is definitely true about Gregor. It's been more than 30 years. I think we met in 1988 or something like that. something completely mad.
Yeah, something like that.
Anyway, and we work together quite a bit, and I don't think that Gregor requires much of the introduction. He's the godfather of the uncontrolled manifold, among many other things. And I'm sure that this is going to be a very different talk compared to the previous two, because the previous two were very experiment-based, and this one is going to be, I believe, very theoretical, philosophical, model-based, and whatever. So, Gregor, why don't you share your screen, and it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mark. So this should be my screen that I'm sharing, right? And
that's very strange. Are you sharing through YouTube?
No, I just...
okay, now. Yeah. No, okay.
Yeah, okay, just a little delay.
Everybody, a reminder, please mute your microphones. Only unmute when you want to speak.
Okay. And so I'm having this little, So welcome to my lecture. I actually put the lecture slides onto this web page here, dynamicfieldtheory.org. I'll briefly show you. If I go there, this is a web page we use for a lot of our modeling work, and right here is a link to a file. So you click on this and go under Documents. There's a little link here actually to the International Society for Motor Control, and then under Documents you can actually download the slides here. So I thought this was useful for those of you who might want to download them, and then you can look ahead and read ahead or go back and so on while I talk. So it might be useful for you to have the slides as a PDF. So I also want to say that this is a theoretical lecture, more theoretical perhaps than others, and I realize that it's not always easy to follow. Sometimes there can be simple conceptual problems and so on. So I'll try to be a little bit more attentive to the questions you're asking. I know there is this delay in YouTube, but occasionally I will use a little break to look there and see if there are questions. And my colleagues have also promised me to follow the questions and maybe bring questions to my attention auditorily when they are questions of understanding, when they need immediate attention. So I'll not answer deeper scientific questions during the talk. I'll do that at the end. But if there's stuff that needs a quick clarification, I'll try to be more attentive to that. And I see that I can, for instance, see chat message coming up here on my screen, so I can try to check that. So what I want to talk about today is what I call a process account of movement generation. And to do that, I'll first give you an overview over all the things that are needed to make movement possible, that will lead to a notion of a neural architecture of movement, very, very general. And then I really want to transmit a few ideas about how one could think of neural processes. And this will be this notion of neural dynamics, which I will try to explain a little bit. And I'll talk about neural oscillations as a basis for time generation, timing, and neural fields as a basis for decision-making, briefly. And the second major topic will be to see how the fact that actuators are actually always endowed with reflexes, which we've heard a lot about in the summer school already, how that affects what the descending activation that comes from high up in the nervous system, what that needs to be like, what properties it needs to have. And I would end on talking about the degree of freedom problem and position that within this sort of integrated approach, a neurodynamic approach. So that's really three concrete topics: this dynamics ideas, the reflex conditioning, the command, and the degree of freedom problem, as illustration of what what an integrated account would be. But I will not really go into the math in a lot of details. In some slides, I will have equations, but the ambition is that you should be able to understand the concepts, even if you don't understand the equations. The equations are for those who like equations, and maybe sometimes to just show that it can be done concretely. But it's not my main goal that you, in the end, know these equations, right? So don't get blocked by the equations, if you can. So, actually, yeah. So what does movement entail? What is required to move? And I'm talking about movement here as movement oriented to things in the world, to objects in the world, as this little caricature on the right illustrates. I'm not talking about, for instance, just undirected movement, because movements like that really bring to the foreground all that is required to do movement. And first thing you observe is that movement, of course, cannot be separated from perception. You need to have some visual information, perceptual information about the scene, about objects in the scene. You will typically direct your attention, for instance, your gaze, at the target object, little drawing here, that amounts to a visual search in many cases, and you will make decisions here, selecting an object and deciding to initiate perhaps a movement. And at some point you will prepare the movement. We know that movements from the very start reflect where they are going to go, which movement time they will occur, and so on. You can tell that from the first few milliseconds of a movement. And theoretically, that really depends on where your hand is initially. So there's already an integration of two sources of information, where your hand is and where you want your hand to go, for instance. And then, of course, you have to generate some time course so that activation is sent to the muscles. And you have to transform these kind of time courses so that they can drive all the different muscles that you have. There will be the degree of freedom problem somewhere in there. And then ultimately, you have to control muscle activation. And we've heard a lot about the fact that depends on peripheral reflex loops. So generating a goal-directed movement entails actually a lot of things. It entails parts of cognition. For instance, you can reach to objects after you've closed your eyes, you base it on memory pretty well. And you do sophisticated visual cognition. For instance, you segment objects so you can estimate where they are and how they're shaped and how you want to shape your hand. Schöner last week showed us a lot about subtleties of that, of how you choose where to reach to a point, the movement. And of course, it entails all this stuff that a lot of the computational people in motor control talk about dealing with forces and resistance to the movement and so on. And then, of course, what we heard about in the periphery. I want to make a brief comment about this computational approach to motor control. I will not be using these concepts, but I want to position myself relative to that. So some people think of, a lot of people would say, think of reaching as a computation. And concretely, let's say the most popular account right now is probably what is called the optimal feedback control theory. And in that account, people take some models of the physics of the movement. They take into account very crude sensor models, and then they find control laws that minimize something physical often, and the control signal itself, and derive what is then called an optimal control law as a norm. And it's a normative approach where you define what the optimal control law in some mathematical sense would be, and then you're looking for evidence for that from properties that you observe in real movement that match the properties of that optimal solution. So in that perspective, for people who think like that, the neural processes are an implementation of these kind of abstract principles. So I'm not going to do that, but I think it's important to realize that is a very common style of thinking. I would say most theoretical modeling is done in this fold currently, and And you will see perhaps why it's attractive to theoreticians when we go along, because you will see that actual neural process models are very, very hard to do and very hard to provide evidence for. I will still try to do that in some places. But you will perhaps also see that that's a very narrow perspective, and that would be maybe more interesting to broaden the perspective here. So what would a neural architecture of reaching look like? So a neural process account, what would it entail? This is an updated figure of a model that we proposed about 10 years ago, and I refer to a lot of details of that. So I will take you through this architecture during the talk, but not in a lot of terrible detail. So it contains a lot, but not everything. For instance, it starts with a vision, and I'll deal a little bit with how you select attentionally objects and how you represent them spatially, very briefly. How you prepare movements, extract from such representations movement parameters. I'll not talk about initiation, termination of movements. I'll not talk about sequence generation. I'll not talk about how you actually have goals when you reach and that inform your visual search. Instead, I will talk about movement timing, so how you actually generate time courses for movement, how you transform that timing into commands to the periphery that have reflex loops in the periphery, and I'll talk about this red stuff, the feedback loops, a lot. But for me to talk about it, I first need to clarify what it even means. In which language can I actually talk about neural processes, about brain-like structures? You can see this slide. I put in gray here roughly some anatomical labels, but this is just sort of for illustration. I'm saying here, this is the spinal cord, there's the sensory motor periphery, cerebellum plays a role, motor cortex, and so on. Our models are not visual cortex, parietal cortex, frontal brain, but our models are not anatomically specific in that sense that we would take particular circuits that we know from particular brain areas, but they are constrained, and I'll show you how they're constrained. And we do compare occasionally to evidence for neural properties in these different brain areas. And so I first want to illustrate to you what it means to be neurally constrained, what it means to have a neural language of process modeling. So the foundations of such modeling are, of course, neurons, model neurons. Very simplistically, as you all know, that neurons are considered threshold elements. So they take a lot of inputs that they sum, and then they make an output. And there's some nonlinearity in that the output is a sigmoidal function of the input. The variables that are used there are either membrane potentials or spiking rate, roughly speaking. There are different microscopic levels of description. You can go in very much detail, or you look at more macroscopic descriptions. I'll very often now talk about activation as an abstract thing that can be viewed as spiking rates in populations of neurons. In a technical sense, it's actually more something like the membrane potential of a lot of neurons, like an average membrane potential. That's a macroscopic picture. It's also, of course, the description that is the basis of connections and neural network modeling. In fact, connections neural networks are essentially just chaining up units like that, where the output of a neuron, which is the output is this sigmoided, as we always say, the thresholded activation. The output is then input to some other neurons, and you can organize that in a feed-forward form, and that's a very popular form that currently, as you know, has a lot of impact in all kinds of areas, including in deep networks, deep learning, data science, and so on. Now, that is a very general way of thinking, but it's clear that is very limited when it comes to movement. A lot of perception or object recognition, categorization, and so on is modeled with these feed-forward neural networks. But movement, it doesn't quite fit so well, because movement is not just a response to input. Now, not all movement is just triggered by the input. There might be some some movements that would be reflex-like, but most movements can be done without an external trigger stimulus. So that picture isn't quite right for that. And we talk about neural activation being autonomously generated, that is being generated within the neural network and not caused by some external stimulus. A feed-forward neural network doesn't do anything unless it gets input. But involuntary movement, that isn't quite right. And so the idea there is that you could have recurrent neural networks that have loops. And recurrent neural networks, as I'll show you now, they can actually generate activation without input, or not exclusively, so not purely based on input. Recurrent neural networks always entail time as a dimension. So you cannot talk about recurrent neural networks without time. I use this illustration to make that clear. So if you have, this is the simplest recurrent neural networks, a single neuron that just feeds back on itself. That's the most radical simplification you could think of. And the problem here is that this neuron gets two inputs. One is an external one, and one is its own output. And of course, you cannot compute the output unless you know the input, which is the output. So there's a problem there. And that problem is solved by the concept of time, assuming essentially that the output that determines the input of this neuron is the output from some earlier time, and then it predicts the output at the next moment in time. And some connections neural networks actually do that in iterative discrete time, but of course in the brain, time isn't really discrete that way. Time is continuous. If you think of spiking in neural networks, you could think that spikes are discrete time, but they aren't really. They sample continuous time. They're not synchronous. It's not like the whole brain is synchronously spiking and sort of in an updating cycle. So you can asynchronous spike trains essentially sample continuous time. So continuous time picture is the right picture. And that really requires for the description a dynamic system. Neural dynamics. Actually, discrete time is also a dynamic system. If the output is a function of the input at the previous time step, then that's a discrete time dynamic system, which is even more mathematically complicated. So we theoreticians think of differential equations as the simpler way to describe time courses. Maybe not intuitive to everyone. So unfortunately, we'll have to talk about dynamic differential equations. Again, you don't need to understand the equation necessarily, but you need to understand the concept. And the concept in neurodynamics is that if you have some activation, I call this activation U here, then it is the rate of change of activation that characterizes the neuron and the neural network. So the rate of change is, if activation was a position, the rate of change would be the velocity. That's the rate at which that variable changes. And so the notion of a dynamic system is that the rate of change, sometimes we put a dot over the U to characterize the du by dt. This is one notation, that's the other notation. Both are used. And the idea is that the rate of change is a function of the current level of activation. Here I've plotted the simplest linear function that is a generic property actually of membranes. The membranes of neurons have that kind of dynamic, so it's a minus u negative slope linear function, usually with some offset, and then there are inputs there. So the rate of change as a function of u is a function of u, and it has this typical form. So it has a negative slope, which means that if you're, for instance, a little bit to the right of here, you have a negative rate of change, and you're following you will decrease activation following the arrow until you arrive at this state where the rate of change is 0, so you'll stay there. You have a little smaller rate of change, you have a positive, small activation, you have a positive rate of change, you will increase in activation, will be attracted there. So you see intuitively, this is actually a stable state, an attractor to which you will converge over time. And that's the output of that neurodynamics. And that would be, in this particular instance, if you have that kind of input. So the input to a neural network, neurodynamics is a contribution to the rate of change. It doesn't fix immediately the activation level, it fixes its rate of change. And you always need that minus u, that negative slope, that makes that then an attractor state. And it's then the minus u, the attraction, the stability mechanism that drives the system to the specified attractor state. So for instance, in this case, if you don't have input, you have a fixed point here at the at this activation level that we call resting level, it's conventionally a negative number. And if you have input, then that shifts the attractor here to the right, and as a result, you will get activation. Simple as that. That's what a neural dynamics is. I didn't include in this picture this loop, actually, which is a nonlinear function. We'll see that in a little while in the simulation. So I wanted to show you a first simple use of neural dynamics to generate autonomously generation, that is to create neural oscillators from neurodynamics. Neural oscillators are an important form of autonomously generated neural activation for movement generation, and I'll elaborate on that in a little while. They arise very naturally in a picture of population in which there are excitatory and inhibitory populations that are mutually coupled. You find that everywhere in cortex and a lot of subcortical structures in the spinal cord. It's always the same idea that some external, this is an excitatory population of excitatory population of neurons. They get direct external input from somewhere. They are self-excitatory. That's what these little arrows are. So here's an ensemble, this is a field, an ensemble of such neurons, and they locally excite each other. But then they get inhibition from some other population of neurons, which I described here by this V variable. That inhibitory population of neurons is driven by the excitatory population, and then conversely inhibits. The very natural pairing excitation inhibition, which leads to the bounding of activation. It's very important for a lot of things. And it has one property, that it tends to generate oscillations. And these are the kinds of oscillations that are entailed in a lot of time course generation. So I wanted to switch now to, wonder if I can do that. Now you should see perhaps my MATLAB program, right? I hope that works. Maybe briefly check on YouTube if that actually works.
It does so far.
Okay, good. And let me check if I have a lot of questions here. No, looks okay. Good. So running the simulator here. What you see in that simulator are two neurons representing a whole population. One neuron is plotted here. This is its time course. This is its dynamics. So this is the rate of change as a function of the activity. The zero crossing is here, the red point currently. There's an attractor here. It's sitting at a negative value at resting level. The green line here is an inhibitory neuron. Again, its rate of change as a function of that activity. Also sitting at attractor at -5, and then here's the time course. Here, the two neurons plotted against each other. In a moment, you will see something happening with that. And get rid of this here. Oops. Where is my... Here. And you see already here this little blip. This is a self-excitatory coupling that I controlled here through those sliders, so that when this neuron is activated, has a positive level of activation, it lifts its rate of change. This blip here is the self-excitatory contribution. There's also inhibitory coupling, that is, when this is positive, it will drive this inhibition up, and when that inhibition is positive, it will inhibit that excitation. And we can make that visible if I just give some input to this neuron. So put the slider here to some positive value. There's a new attractor here. The old one actually become unstable. The neuron turns on. Now it drives inhibition. And when the inhibition has become positive, it starts to inhibit that neuron. And when it's inhibited enough, excitation falls away and the inhibition goes down, and so on, goes around in a circle, and you see a oscillation emerges from this. The time scale of that oscillation reflects the distance of the thresholds for, the activation state from the thresholds for the two neurons. See it go around in a circle. That's a generic property of excitatory inhibitory population coupling. And so thought widely to be the base for any kind of autonomously timed process in the nervous system, including movement. So I'll stop that simulation. It costs a lot of energy, and go back to my presentation. Oops. Okay. Now, wanted to use that to jump right into the idea of generating time courses. So I'll start here in the middle, because it's sort of a central property to generate time courses to make movements. And this is, again, summarizing that neural oscillators can generate timing signals. And one thought is that what these neural oscillators do is generate something like a velocity or speed like reference signal. This is from a model that we have. In these kind of models, you don't necessarily have to have these oscillators run continuously. They can run a single cycle and then turn themselves off. It's called an active transience. It's also a generic property of these kind of dynamical systems. And they can have different amplitude and duration relationships that reflect then that there will be a amplitude encoded in this. So if you have a larger peak velocity and a shorter movement time, then you reach a certain amplitude, and that could be invariant as you change movement time. This is from a model that I'll explain only later that shows that the actual hand controlled by a neural signal like that has a similar time course, but is time delayed, because in the end, of course, this neural population will have to go through many other layers to bring about movement. And that might be an important piece of information. We'll come back to that. Now, here's an example of signals that can be used as evidence that these sort of things do happen in the brain. Nobody really knows exactly the neural populations that are involved in timing. It could be distributed across many populations. Andrew Schwartz's lab has for years shown that there is a strong congruency between activity in a motor context, essentially the amplitude-tuned activity and its time course, and the time course of the actual movement of the hand in space. So these are monkeys that make different movements. In this case, these are actually drawing movements, and you're constructing from a neural population. These are examples of tuning curves of neurons to amplitude. You can construct from them a population representation of speed, and that population representation predicts the speed of the hand. There's a delay between those, just like in the model that I just showed you, which again might reflect that all the processing that then has to happen. Another group that is arguing for that is the group of Churchland, as some of you might know, who looks, for instance, at monkeys doing a periodic task and then constructs from population recordings in motor cortex periodic signals. Or you can actually wonder sometimes if it's a bit circular, the argument he uses there, because you do something periodic and you observe something periodic. But it's at least interesting that the activity in motor cortex is periodically organized. There's a lot of behavior signatures that something like that happens. The question is really about is at which level does that activation reside? So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I think many of you will know that this theme of using oscillators to explain the timing of movement has been used in the past to account for coordination, for the relative timing of movement, so that when two movements, let's say two limbs move, that they would tend to align. So if they're temporarily misaligned, there would be some restoring force that would align them so that they can be synchronous. Same with movement time to some perceived event. For instance, if you catch a ball or you dance or you follow a metronome, then you will be able to align your timing with that perceived timing. And the idea is that that could arise very naturally from oscillators, neural oscillators, that drive the different limbs, or that might be reflect perceptual processes. And generically, when neural oscillators like that are coupled, they will phase align. This will be phase locking, where the dynamics of the relative phase is a function of, so again, the dynamic system as an attractor and the attractor will be the timed movement. I think there was maybe briefly check. If there was a question. Can't seem to. I think I have to stop sharing to see that, right? Maybe look on YouTube if there's a question here. Okay, maybe not. Good, and this account for coordination is supported essentially by predictions about instabilities in relative timing. I'm not explaining this here. If you know about that, that's where you can locate that in this big architecture somewhere. Time courses are generated by neural populations that oscillate, and it's the coupling among different populations like that that accounts for coordination, and including these instabilities. And in fact, there's one interesting wrinkle of that work. There's a lot of different arguments can be brought to bear, but one wrinkle of this work is that it seems that the relative timing is really about space, about hand in space, about the functional level, task level. So, for instance, this group around Prince 2 decades ago showed that the stability of the coordination pattern was determined by the spatial arrangement of the limbs, for instance, that spatially things this would be anti-phase or symmetrically in phase, and not the anatomical arrangement. And that is maybe in some sense also plausible for a lot of action perception skills. For instance, when you follow a metronome and you synchronize with the metronome, the muscles actually need to anticipate. They are to achieve, a perfect synchronicity. You would have to send the signal to your limb, probably like 180 or 100 milliseconds before the event, like the tap that makes the synchronous signal. And you will routinely, without any special effort, achieve synchronization at the perceptual level. So it's the perceptual outcome or task level at which that coordination occurs. That would be an argument I'll use a little later to talk about the degree of freedom problem. And briefly have a look at the questions here. Nothing time asynchronous, but is perceived discretely. Well, there are actually two different forms of synchronization. Maybe I can react to that right away. There is synchronization in a continuous sense when you make smooth movements, and there is synchronization of events, for instance, initiation and termination events. And for instance, tapping involves such events where you can see that it's only certain parts of your movement that are synchronized. Both of these can be actually understood in the same way. The processes of initiation and termination, which I don't really elaborate here, are also processes of the same nature. There is actually something, it's actually, again, an active transit when you autonomously switch from on to off and off to on, that has the same signature as a neural oscillator. It's not causing the time course, it's actually causing the time course of the initiation signal. So this would apply to both forms of synchronization. Okay. I can skip this. This again, it doesn't really assume that movement has to be rhythmic. In discrete movement, discrete events, you can have coordination in the same style. Okay, that's all I want to say about timing. I didn't want to elaborate too much on timing. So how do you connect neural process models like that to sensory information, right? I briefly talked about connectionism and then said recurrent, and I now used oscillation as a good example of what a strongly recurrent neural network is like. But how do I reconcile that with input? And of course, no big secret, somewhere in the periphery, you have sensory neurons that respond to some physical intensity, let's say photoreceptors on retina or these various kind of receptors, always of tensions, always hair cells in the skin or in the auditory system. They are essentially transduced to some external physical property is in a functional relationship with the activation inside the system. This is what theoreticians call rate code somewhere in the periphery. And then you get meaningful information from that by having a whole lot of sensors like that. For instance, on your retina, you have different neurons that look at different locations of the retina. And they project onto populations of neurons, for instance, in cortex or LGN, so that different parts of that population are driven by different sensors like that. And therefore, you get a neural map from that forward connectivity, creating what is called a space code, or sometimes called a population code. And of course, it isn't just maps of the retinal space and surfaces. It's also feature spaces. So, for instance, you can extract through the forward connectivity particular visual features or auditory features and so on. And so these neural maps can ultimately create internal activation patterns that reflect what's outside the system. So here's a very simple model that just takes some visual measures, actually the saturation of the color scene, and creates a representation of the visual array. This is over the retina or the visual array. And for each of these objects, you have a blob of activation. And here the activation reflects that there is something in the screen. So the level of activation is about the visual signal, but the spatial arrangement reflects that scene. And that would be a simplest form of scene representation that you could try to base your movement on. Now, I'll want to ground that right away in this problem in the visuals, in the movement system, how visual information that informs movement can be thought to come about. And of course, the first thing it needs to do is needs to select one of those objects. For instance, here I have this model here is able to select one of those three blobs of activation for this object in order to then direct action at that object. And I wanted to illustrate how that kind of selection works. And what you need to do that is again have more than the feed forward representation of input. So this is a generalization of the neurodynamics I had before. The generalization is that I have a variable x, a dimension. So I have a lot of neurons that represent different things. You could think in this example, the x to be the visual space that would have 2 dimensions. I'm just plotting 1 dimension here, the visual space. So this is the same we saw before, and it will be driven by input only if I stop here. So this would correspond here to this picture where the activation is really just a reflection of the input pattern. But then when I make selection, I need to stabilize or keep around one of those peaks and suppress the other ones. And that is achieved by this term, which is what we call neural interaction. So it's a term that essentially says local neurons that are neighboring in the field dimension in the map excite each other, and neurons that are further from each other, they inhibit each other. So, for instance, this population here is also driven by input, but it is suppressed by that activation. While when it's suppressed, it cannot conversely suppress this activation because we have this sigmoid transmission function that is only neurons that are sufficiently activated can contribute. Neurons that are below 0 in these models, 0 is often the threshold. When they're below 0, they have no impact. They cannot affect other populations. That's the generic picture. It's interaction dominated so-called neural field, and that is essentially the language that we can use throughout this architecture that I'm hinting at. And I wanted to show you again in a simulation some properties of this, which when I switch back here to my MATLAB program, run another little simulator. So here, loaded something in first. So here, pay attention to the top. Actually, at the bottom is just a static plot that shows you the interaction kernel. I'll make this a little larger. You can see this really nicely on your screen. And so this will not change. So the local excitation, global inhibition, this is a reflection of the kernel that applies anywhere in this field. The blue line that fluctuates a little bit here. That's the activation field that I will be talking about. It's over some dimension that I don't specify here. Let's say it could be visual space. You see a little noise, that's why it fluctuates. It's at a negative level of activation currently. You see behind the blue line is a green line that is actually the input plus the resting level. And I will be playing with that by moving that slide. And you see when I put some Gaussian input in here, then the blue tracks the green. So this is the input-driven activation. But when I get above threshold, then you will see the red line starts to move. And that's the thresholded, the sigmoid applied to the activation, the thresholded field. And when that enters, something happens. And I'll show you here. I'll just increase this a little bit and stop increasing it now. And you see that something happens. That's an instability. What happens is that the pattern where the activation is equal to the input, so the blue is equal to the green, becomes unstable, and a new solution forms. We call that a peak of activation. So its threshold activation is this red box here. That's now ready to impact on other representation. That's sort of the unit of representation of these neural dynamic models. This is an instability that you can see that, for instance, from the fact that if I decrease input again a little bit, you see perhaps now that activation is again below the threshold where the peak was induced, the peak persists. So here you have activation that is largely autonomously generated. It's another instance of self-generation of activation from within, here from the recurrent connectivity of that kernel. That is actually the mechanism underlying initiation, termination, sequences, and so on, but I'm not talking about that much in this lecture. What I want to emphasize is that that mechanism is sufficient to do selection decisions. For instance, if I introduce another peak somewhere else, let's say, oops, actually I made it too large now. We use a parameter regime where the interaction is a little bit stronger. Then you see that now it selects this particular peak and suppresses that peak. So you see the field like that is capable of making selection decisions and actually stabilizes them. So for instance, if I give the second input a boost, it will not necessarily overturn the decision. It can at some point. If I make the boost large enough, at some point it will overturn the decision. The system can switch, and then it will stabilize that choice. So for instance, now it stays the same input, it stays at that decision. I just mentioned for fun, or for those who want to know these things, that this is also a model of working memory. So for instance, if I just boost the field, I can have peaks that persist even in the absence of any kind of input. Hopefully this is true. So this peak will stay around just because previously there was input here. And that's a standard kind of model of working memory. And that's, of course, a very clear case of neural activation that is generated autonomously without input. That's all I want to demonstrate today about these neural fields. Okay. Maybe I have a quick look at YouTube to see intentional, unintentional movements. I'll come back to that later. Yeah. Okay. So when you want to select a movement, you have to do that, of course, based on some cue. Maybe I'll skip that actually. This is about visual search. It's a more realistic picture of selection, but that maybe goes too far, so I'll skip that. So just assuming that this perceptual front end can deliver to the motor system some target, a visually represented target that's in some visual coordinate frame, and then what you need is really to extract from that movement parameters that's based on where your hand initially. We know that there are these movement parameters, like movement amplitude and movement direction. And they are represented by fields just like that. And I just want to highlight. So we've done a lot of work on that. There's a lot of interesting constraints, both neural and behavioral, on that process, where you're looking at, for instance, how the reaction time to a motor command, to an imperative signal, varies with the prior information you have either about direction or amplitude and all kinds of things. Just maybe highlight that this is where the notion of population code comes from. Jacopoulos, of course, who is very prominent, and Andrew Schwartz worked in his lab when he did some of this early work, where you can estimate from the tuning curves of cortical neurons distributions of population activation, which are literally neural estimates of these fields. The fields are, the population vector, and the distribution is essentially the underlying activation distribution over movement direction. And that's essentially what the fields model in this domain. So again, I don't want to go deeper into that. So that, up to this point, that was essentially sort of the front end. If I go here back, this entire front end, I wanted to sketch just in this rough form. So we've done movement timing, movement preparation, and the perceptual front end. Now I want to go down here to the bottom and ask, how would signals like that, neural activation patterns like that, drive the motor system, the muscles ultimately? And then we'll talk about the gap. How do we get from some timing signal that might reflect the hand's velocity in space to these activation patterns that really need to drive the muscles? There's a gap between those, and that's the degree of freedom problem. So that's where I'm heading. So at this bottom, you've heard a lot about that. Anatol Feldman talked about that, and I think it showed up in certainly in Marco's talk last week, and Mindy, of course, talked about that. So here is my theoretician's summary of that. Essentially, the caricature of the stretch reflex, where this would be a motor neuron, and alpha motor neuron, and it would ultimately generate muscle activation that changes the length of the muscle. That will ultimately change the length, the joint angle with other muscles. And then we know there is sensory activation being sent back to that alpha motor neuron that comes from spindle organs and other things that will be summed with a descending command and will determine muscle activation. So in that sense, the descending activation is not the only factor that determines muscle activation, because there is that feedback loop. And here is just a mental simulation to see what would happen if you make a simple movement, a joint angle that changes in a particular direction. I'm looking at the sensor activation and the descending activation for the agonist only, let's say, just to make it simple. So the agonist was initially, let's say, longer and then is shortened. And as a result, when it was longer, the sensory activation signal was stronger, and a stronger signal here. And then when it shortens, it sends less of a signal here. And therefore, the muscle activation will rise when a descending signal is sent to that agonist. The agonist has to be activated, right? So the descending signal must activate that muscle. And initially, muscle activation will arise as the descending signal arises. But as we know, over the course of the movement, muscle activation will then actually fall off, and you will have a new equilibrium posture at the end of the movement. And that comes about because the length will actually signal this changed length of the agonist muscle, and so you have now less of a signal here. So you actually need more descending activation to make up for that loss. If you didn't do that, then muscle activation would actually not be a threshold. So you have a very qualitatively very different shape of muscle activation than of the descending activation that goes to that muscle. So the descending signal actually makes a real change. So it's really different, initially than after the movement, while muscle activation is transient during the movement. So a lot of theoreticians in this computational frame are always talking about this black stuff, the muscle activation, this transient signal, while at equilibrium point people talk about the red line. They frame it usually in length. This would be the lambda, the virtual length. Here I'm framing it in terms of activation to match the muscle activation. And you see they're qualitatively different. So when you make a voluntary movement, at the end of the movement, you have a different level of the descending signal than you had earlier. It's not like you're going back to zero, and that is to solve the posture movement problem, as Anatol and Mark have famously argued, that you know, at the end of the movement, you have to permanently shift the threshold for this reflex so that then the reflex doesn't pull you back. To fully understand that, you also need to take into account that there's an antagonist that opposes this muscle. What I want to do now is ask if we can directly estimate that descending signal. So if we could, from what we know about the reflexes, and we know a lot, and muscles, and from movement, could we estimate what this looks like? And that would be, for us theoreticians, then a good way of guessing what kind of account I have to generate at that level of the brain that generates the descending signal. So ultimately, that time generation must be the signal that generates that descending activation. And I want to take you now through three different ways how we have tried to estimate that descending activation. The third one is actually Li Zhang's, and I'll just hint at it, and then it's through his work. He will present more on that in the future. So a very direct way, I can't say simple, but very direct way of doing that is just to take a model, a neuromuscular model, a model of the muscle dynamics, of biomechanical dynamics, and the reflex, and invert the model. I'll show you. This can only be done with some simplification. It doesn't actually have biarticulatory muscles, or only 4 muscles for 2 joints. It's based on the Gribble-Austria et al. Model. Many of you know that Anatol Feldman, for instance, has also used in some of his modeling. And just take you through that very briefly. You don't need to understand the equations, just to understand what processes they are linked to. So here is the reflex model. So this is the length of the muscle, that's the contraction rate of the muscle, and that's the descending activation. Usually people think of minus that being lambda, and here I'm using activation. So this plus sign just means it's a semi-linear threshold function. So if the length or rate of change exceeds the implicit threshold that this activation sets, then there will be activation. Sorry, my mouse is very sensitive. And if it doesn't exceed, then there is no activation. So A is the muscle activation generated by the descending command. So essentially, this thing here, the descending is U, and this here is the sensory activation is modeled by this L and an L dot term, these 2 terms here. That activation is transformed to ultimately to forces through some models. There's some essentially, this would be what usually a Hill model would do, and this is a simplification. It has the calcium dynamics that takes care of the fact that there is some time that is needed to build up activation. We have a quick look at the messages if there is some direct question. Delays, yes, the level means to differentiate intentional and unintentional. I cannot say that now, but the delays, I can say that in this particular estimate, we neglect the delay, but there is actually some delay implied by the calcium dynamics, and that we can deal with. And in forward simulation, we can actually see how much that matters. It doesn't really matter hugely. So I can take then the model that we have and delay it, and then there is no big change. But it's a question as a limitation of how we can deal with that. So this here captures some of the, like this is the passive elasticity of the muscle. And this is a crude approximation that does something like a hill model. It's just simplified. A hill model is an implicit model, much more difficult to invert, and this here makes it possible to invert it. So once you have the forces from the muscles, you get the torques by just the moment arms, and then you insert that into your equation of motion. So these are the active torques here are, I should have used the same letter. It's the active torque, and this would be the, all the other forces, inertial matrix. And so this is just about biomechanics. And inverting this would mean that we observe joint trajectories in a set of movements. So we have the thetas, we compute the theta dots and the theta 2 dots. We can insert that into the inertial and Coriolis and centripetal force and so on. And from that, we can compute then the active torque that must have been applied, the active torque. And then we have the moment arms, we compute the forces, and then we can actually invert this. This requires some approximation. We extract from that ultimately the muscle activation. We insert the muscle activation, and we can get the descending command. That only works if the muscles fire. If it doesn't work when everything is zero here, so we have different cases that we need to distinguish. There's some technicalities, but it can be done most of the time. And here is an example to show how it works. Here is the movement paths as observed in experiments. So the red and magenta are the two directions of movement for a total of 8 movements that participants made. Here, this is a little experimental sketch. This is work that Cora Hummer did in our lab. So she looked at people making these different movements, did them in a slow and a fast condition. The fast was probably as fast as you can go with this kind of movement. So it's aimed at having 400 milliseconds movement time in these kind of two-dimensional movements. And you see the model prediction. So when you estimate the motor command, the descending activation, and then insert that into the model to look what movements you get, then you see that it's not as bad as that. The paths are pretty well matched. And this is now the interesting plot, because this shows now really what I hypothesized to be the conceptual models. The solid are the fast, the dashed are the slow movements, and the green, unfortunately the green might not be very visible. The green line is the muscle activation, the blue line is the descending activation. And there are 4 muscles here. These are I don't even remember what the letters stand for. The 4 muscles of a 2-limb arm, your agonist, antagonist for the 2. Extensor flexor, this is shoulder, this is elbow. And then you have these 8 movements. And you see a very general pattern. The green always goes from 0 back to 0, right? 0, up, 0. 0, ultimately back to 0, because that's muscle activation. At the end of the movement, your muscles go back to silent, and in between they fire. Sometimes they fire biphasically, sometimes monophasically, depending on the role of the muscle in the movement. While the blue makes a shift, right? It goes from some initial level to some final level. That's your equilibrium point shift that you, of course, need to be at a different level after the movement to compensate for what happens in the reflex loop. The interesting thing, look at the blue and then compare the dash to the solid, and you see that in the slow movement, that shift it's not quite a ramp, but it is almost like a ramp. It's sort of like a somewhat smoothed ramp with the onset and offset not being quite as rigorous here. This almost looks like a ramp. But when you look at the fast movement, then you see it's a more complex time function. You see a chat question: isn't inverting cause and effect against physical laws? And I can. So this is just inverting it mathematically. Of course, in the arm, it is the neural commands that force the muscles, and those create the movement. But I can trace it back. So when I say inverted, I can just estimate what the cause must have been from observing the effect. So that's very routinely done for just inverting the mechanical part. So for instance, you observe joint angles, and then you can infer what the torques must have been by using the equation of motion to say, if this is the solution, what must have been the forces to create that solution? You can mathematically do that under some assumptions. So it doesn't violate anything physical. It's just a mathematical analysis. So we learned two things from this. So we learned that this qualitative picture that I hypothesized is right, that is muscle activation tends to be transient, but the descending command is really making a tonic change. And we see there's a difference between slow and fast movement, that in fast movement, the timing of the descending command is more complex. It essentially needs to make some larger bumps, essentially to get the movement going. And then in some sense may also break. Here's a different way of looking at that. Here we transform the descending command back into something like a lambda, a virtual trajectory for the two joint angles. The red line is the real joint angle in the slow case for shoulder and elbow, and in the fast case, these red bars reflect something about variability. And what you see in these different curves from black to blue are different estimates of the underlying virtual trajectory. So if we transform the descending activation into a equilibrium length, actually equilibrium joint angle for with two muscles always converging on a joint, then we get these different virtual trajectories. And what we did here is vary the stiffness. We can't actually estimate in this approach the stiffness. We have to assume it. So we just varied it within the regime that is considered plausible. The black is the stiffest. The blue is the least stiff. And so you see that in the fast movement, this temporal modulation of the descending command is strongest if you have a not very stiff muscles. So the stiffness comes from co-contraction, right? If they don't contract very strongly. But even at the strongest thinkable stiffness, you still see a little hump here. Sorry. You see that it overshoots and then goes back. So that reflects some real effort to accelerate, and then you stop accelerating so strongly at the end. So here the braking is largely passive, while in these less stiff cases, it is actually active braking in a sense. So this goes back to the N-shaped kind of trajectory that Mark Latasch postulated many years ago. When Mark Latasch was doing that, he was using a linear model for the mass spring kind of model, and that was criticized, and it was maybe quantitatively not correct. But this is actually the model that has been used as the more correct version that predicted ramp-like virtual trajectories. But by pushing it to faster movements, we observe these temporal complexities. Second approach we used was to estimate the descending command as some kind of optimal command, and optimal, we call it minimal, in the sense that we say we recognize that we need to change descending activation, really a step change. It doesn't make sense to, if you take a signal like that, let me go back here. People sometimes think that you want to minimize the area under this. That would be like minimal muscle activation. It doesn't make sense to minimize the area under the descending activation, because that's open-ended. You have to define where you end minimizing that. And so we're saying it's not so much about minimizing this; it's about minimizing its rate of change. The joint. Somebody's asking if the joint level is in the model. The joint level is in the model. The joint, this model here, this here is the joint level, right? It just feeds the torque. So I got a little bit confused about what the torques are. The active torques are these. This would be any external torques. The active torques are these here, and this is the C contains all the Coriolis and centripetal forces, and so this is the joint level. Right? So what we're actually saying is that we're not minimizing the motor command, the descending command, we're minimizing its rate of change. Because you have to change it to get the movement. So we want to have the minimal change. And in fact, if the plant is trivial, that is, if you have perfectly stiff muscles and you have no inertia, and so all of it, so that the muscle, the joint follows exactly the descending command, then the solution of this minimization problem would be the ramp. So essentially, we're saying, how different from a ramp do we have to be to bring about the movement? And so to bring about the movement means that the movement amplitude and the movement time is as required. We also require some smoothness, that it starts with zero velocity and zero acceleration. And we impose some limits on the maximum rate of change, maximum accelerations, and so on. And then that was numerically solved as an optimization problem. And then that actually has 6 muscles. It has biarticulatory muscles as well, these green ones. And some interesting stuff comes from that. Again, that works reasonably well. These are the paths. The blue is the experiment, the black is the model. They don't lie exactly on top of each other because, in the previous experiment, we used the data to estimate the parameters. Here, we're not using that. We're just creating an optimal model. And so there are some calibration things that we didn't use the exact same joint configuration as the participants did. We had some average participant. We didn't have the same arm length for, the different participants differ in that, and we just had some slightly different numbers. But the overall shape is good. And this is the kind of descending activations that we get. Here we had 3 speeds in the model. We had the slowest, the dotted, the medium speed is the dashed, and the fastest is the solid. And this is just an example, the flexor and extensor muscles, and there are the biarticulatory muscles are in black, the elbow and the shoulder, and this is for just one movement. I don't remember which one it is. But it's very typical, very, very similar across all of those, and you see the same sort of phenomenon that the command is sort of ramp-like for the slow movements, and then it gets more articulated. It sort of overshoots and then relaxes back for the faster movements. And that is actually really interesting. This overshooting means that it pulls more strongly, right? You give it a strong signal initially to accelerate. The deceleration doesn't really require as much of an effort. It doesn't go to the other side here in this example. That really comes from the fact that the velocity-dependent terms help braking while they oppose moving. And so there's a little bit of an asymmetry here. Interesting observation is that you can transform these estimated motor commands into end effector space. We use the Hodgson-Hogan attractor trajectories. I don't know if anybody knows that. So you compute theoretically from the model the hand path that would at which all the forces are in equilibrium. And so this is in a long movement direction, and that is along orthogonal to the movement direction. And if this for the 8 different movements, you see it's astoundingly uniform. So here you see a very clean ramp in end effector space now. For the slowest movement, the dotted line is a very clean ramp. It goes all the way through the movement. The ramp at the muscle level actually sort of finishes early, something Anatol Feldman has actually shown experimentally, that before you're done around peak velocity, your muscle descending command is already at its target. But if you look at that end effector space trajectory, it actually is more like a ramp that goes along the entire movement. And then as you go to higher speeds, it essentially has this moving ahead of the virtual trajectory that is a acceleration, and then lagging behind. That's sort of like a deceleration. While orthogonal, it is not modulated much. It's modulated mostly for movements for which there are a lot of interaction torques. And so these reflect really the interaction torques that happen. So that might reflect back on where the time signal comes from, that the time signal might actually be of this nature and is transformed into more complex time signals by the problem of, by the degree of freedom problem. I think I'm kind of okay in time, so maybe I can just hint at that third approach that we have developed. It is actually largely the idea of Li Zhang, who worked with Anatol Feldman on this. My role here is quite minor. So he said, can I actually use the MG to directly estimate the activation from the EMG? And I just hint at that. The idea is that you do an unloading experiment. This so far it's only worked for a single degree of freedom, and he's now expanding it to 2 degrees of freedom. So for a wrist movement, the idea is you unload, and in an unloading condition, you try to get some calibration of how much EMG change corresponds to how much change in threshold length. In the unloading, you see the threshold length. Now, for instance, here, this is an unloading example before, and then you unload with different amounts. This is for the extensor muscle. And so you end up at different muscle lengths because you have different loads here. And the idea would be, can you say how much EMG change corresponds to how much threshold change? And that threshold change, EMG change correlation gives you essentially a measurement procedure, so that then if you look at a real movement, you can take the EMG and predict the threshold at that level. And that is an estimate of the descending motor command. So here's an example of doing that. This is during a slow or a fast single joint movement. And you see that this is the extensor muscle and the flexor muscle for that. The movement was a flexion movement. So this is, ramp-like, you would say. The different mu values are the different values of this velocity-dependent term in the model, which we cannot estimate. And so we just varied that, giving it different plausible values, plausible in terms of how other people have fitted these models. And you see, it doesn't matter so much for the slow movements. Pretty much the same descending activation estimated that way. While for the fast movement, it matters a little bit more, but not terribly much. You see again this non-monotonic shape for the flexor command. In fact, the early phase is not very dependent on that, because in the early phase, L dot is not very large, and then the late phase depends a little bit on it. So you see, for fast movements, you have also this non-monotonic timing signal, and that, I would say, the message behind that, I have that here on the next slide. What's the message of all of this? So first of all, it's clear that the descending activation is not just specifying torque or specifying force. So it's been something that Anatol and Mark and others have emphasized many times. It's qualitatively different from that. It is not returning to zero. So it's not that the force generation itself is what makes the movement. For slow movement, the descending command is sort of like a monotonic shift that could be well thought of as a shift of the equilibrium position, this sort of idea of a ramp or virtual trajectory. But for fast movement, it has more complex, say here, non-monotonic temporal properties, temporal shape, and that reflects the biophysics of the movement. It reflects interaction torques and muscle dynamics. Reflects in the sense that if by sending down a complex signal like that, the right torques are generated at the right time to counteract interaction torques, and that leads to these smooth and fast velocity profiles that we see in movements like that, natural movements. You saw the paths are not perfectly straight, but are certainly somewhat straight, and they are made straight in part by these kinds of descending commands, that descending activation patterns that compensate for the interactions that occur. And in fact, the descending activation seems to be simpler and more invariant in end effector space than in the space of these individual muscles, where they vary, of course, with location and joint space. So there is a hint here, but only a first hint, that the problem could be, again, simpler if transformed back into the original space, in the sense of the space in which I hypothesized that timing signals are framed. That would be the end effector space. And so that's the last topic I wanted to discuss is this degree of freedom problem that Marco was talking about last Saturday a lot. And that's essentially the recognition that at some level in this hierarchy, there are spatial representations. I've claimed that it's really already the time signal, the time moving, the signal that governs coordination, that is at the spatial level, that is about hand in space or end effector in space. And somewhere down here where we're just talking, it has to send special signals to different muscles. So the different muscles have very different time courses, as you saw, complex time courses. And so what's the relationship between those? And it's a degree of freedom problem because, of course, there are many more muscles than there are end effector velocities. In fact, if you think of the end effector velocity profile in an approximately straight movement, it's actually a single number. It's where you are along the path. And then there are many muscles involved in actually bringing about that movement. And so how does one think of that gap? And again, very analogously to how I started out, there's a tradition to think of that as a feed-forward computational problem. So this is a caricature of a feed-forward neural network that would translate this spatial level that would have fewer degrees of freedom, let's say just 2 degrees of freedom, to many degrees of freedom, the muscle and joint level. And that feed-forward connectivity that would be encoded in neural network would lead to co-activation of the different muscles when you have a particular velocity signal here at that level. So that's the caricature of the classical synergy concept. And it leads to characteristic predictions, and that's where this idea comes from. The predictions really, if you vary the movement task, for instance, you insert variation here by varying time, looking at different moments in time during the movement, or by varying different the task. So, for instance, setting different movement amplitudes or different goals, different directions, and so on. Then there should be covariation here at this level that reflects that variation. Covariation meaning that this variation is constrained by this neural network to reflect just the dimensionality of the change here and not the dimensionality of the change there. And that kind of dimensionality reduction is then a signature of covariation. And as many of you know, there's a lot of evidence for that. If you look at large ensembles of different movements, using time as a dimension and using movement task as a dimension, then you get a reduction of these matrices. Here's an example of that work from Lina Ting's lab, where in this case, actually from muscle EMG, you're trying to see how much of the muscle EMG can I create with just a smaller set of hypothesized task variables, and as you can estimate the weighting matrices of a neural network. And this is just a mathematical model, a linear model, but it could be thought of as standing for a neural network model. Can I predict these, determine these weights so that I account for the variance of this across time and across task by a smaller number? Let me check brain lateralization. I will come to that later. That's a research program. Now, I would say that research program, one can actually empirically it's true. There is this reduction in dimensionality. It's a question if it really means anything, in the sense that perhaps if it's just a question of how much variance did you actually induce. So, for instance, if your trajectories are simple, then there is essentially no chance for the system to unfold its true variance. And you can ask, how invariant are these across different settings? Do you always get the same combinations? So a lot of things can be discussed. Don't want to go into that too much. It's empirically true that there is this covariation. I want to emphasize one aspect where this is not true, and that's the aspect where you look at random variation. So random variation is for us very important, as I already emphasized a lot, because variability is a signature of stability. So stability counteracts variability, and therefore different degrees of variability reflect different degrees of stability. Now, this is not the variability that comes about by looking at time or by looking at different tasks. Those would be considered different conditions. You can't really consider those to be samples of stability. No, this is the variability that arises spontaneously. So in movement tasks, it would be typically thought of as arising from trial to trial under identical conditions. In rhythmic tasks, it would be maybe variability from cycle to cycle, but it's important that you're always looking at the same point in the movements, for instance, the same percentage point in time, let's say after 30% of the movement time, given a certain amplitude of the movement, given certain frequency of the movement, so on, what's my motor state then? Right? That would be purely random variance. So you insert random variation here, and then this model will predict that the variance that you get out of that will be the same kind of variance that you observed when you inserted time here or task here, right? It will be the same directions. Doesn't matter if it's random variation or whatever it is. Any random variation here induces the covariance here. If you insert variance here, for instance, muscle noise, that will be uncorrelated because it doesn't reflect that matrix, right? So that will be just whatever the noise source is. So that model predicts that you either see the same covariation that was observed when you vary time or task, or you see no covariation. But what you actually empirically see is the opposite of that. And to understand that, I need to remind you of the UCM idea. Many of you know that, I think. So here for joints, not for muscles, very simple idea. You have 3 joints, let's say, to controlling just 2 end effector positions, just to understand that. And there is some, that means you have multiple solutions. I've shown 2 solutions to a postural problem, achieving that pointer position with the dark blue or the light blue configuration. And that implies some kind of covariation. For instance, it means that if this wrist joint is flexed a little bit more, then the elbow has to be flexed a little bit less so that your pointer stays on the target. And of course, it's not just binary, it's in 3-dimensional space here for the 3 joints. And the formalization of that is to say, at any given position of this end effector position, I have a whole line in 3-dimensional joint space, this red line here, that would be all the different joint configurations that are consistent with the pointer being at this location. And you have a slightly different pointer position, it's this red line. And if you have an even more different one, it's maybe that red line. And this red line is what we call the uncontrolled manifold, which is called the self-motion manifold in robotics. So when you vary the task, which would mean varying, making a movement, moving this pointer somewhere, then you would be seeing movement in this direction. You would move from one manifold to another manifold and so on. Similarly, to if you vary in time, you would see, move across these different manifolds. So you would see something in this direction. I mean, it could be slightly oblique, but it would be a change across the different manifolds. Well, if you're moving within the manifold, there will be this change from this configuration, the start to the light configuration. There will be a movement that keeps the pointer tip invariant, so it will be within the manifold. There will be that blue kind of covariation. I call that compensatory covariation, and this would be the covariation generated by the classical synergy. And you see, it's largely orthogonal. It's not necessarily exactly orthogonal because these are somewhat curved spaces, but it is essentially orthogonal. And empirically, we find that the structure of variance reflects the blue kind of stuff and not the red kind of stuff. Here are examples. So here is a classical, this is, I forgot the reference here. This is old work with John Schultz on pointing in 3D with a pointer in 3D and 10 degrees of freedom across time. And again, the red is the variance that lies within that actually here the color code is the opposite. I'm sorry. So here the red is lying within the uncontrolled manifold and the blue is orthogonal to it. And see, it's a lot more variance that is along the uncontrolled manifold than orthogonal to it. So that's the opposite of what classical synergy would predict. And in shooting, some of you know that work that was done in Mark's lab by John Schultz. And there you find it's not the gun spatial position that captures that difference, but it's the gun orientation to the target that's relevant for the task. We have a lot more variance that keeps the gun orientation to the target invariant than that doesn't. So how can one understand that? So the forward structure is not enough, right? But the forward structure is true in some other from some other evidence, and we've modeled that. It's a complicated model that I'm not going to explain here. And essentially, there are two important components to that model that are very intuitive, and that's why I think I can explain this here. So one idea is that these descending commands here, they don't, they're not the only thing. They do go to, let's say, motor neurons that go to the muscles, but there is also coupling between those motor neurons. And that coupling is organized to make compensatory covariation. That is, for instance, let's say, simplistically speaking, if this motor neuron fires a little more than it should for this movement, then it inhibits some other motor neuron to fire a little bit less, so that the outcome is closer to what would have happened if it had fired just average. This is an idea that actually Mark Latter once did for a isometric model, and that he called that some variable comes from the free body problem. I think we have to discuss that later. So it's analogous to the model that Mark did, but this is not isometric, but it's for actually the dynamics of the movement. So that contributes. We found that we also needed a second mechanism. This was not enough, and it's a complex story. For instance, motor equivalence really requires that second mechanism, and that was a mechanism in which we said, if the outcome, oops, sorry, my mouse is so sensitive. If the outcome is a little bit different, let's say one muscle fired a little bit more than it should have, then what you also find is that the sensed muscle change updates the command, the descending signal, and it updates it in a compensatory fashion. So it's actually, the idea is what would be called yielding. For instance, if you think like some external force prevents your effector from reaching what the descending activation specifies as an equilibrium position. Let's say because there's an external perturbation, that would be motor equivalence. Then we're saying to get the other joints that are not blocked, let's say, to adjust, they need to be informed in a way about the fact that what this motor neuron commands is blocked. And the idea would be that the sensory information about that leads to an update of the descending activation that yields to the perturbation. So that would be the opposite of feedback control. It's sort of feedback with negative sign. So rather than drive the plant to the plan, you update the plan to adjust to the plan. So say, oh, that's where I ended up. Okay, that's fine. That would, if you just had that, then you would never be able to make a movement because you wouldn't reach the state. And the idea is that you only do that will only be effective in the subspace in this high-dimensional system, in which there is no descending command that specifies the goal state. So the subspace specified by that, which is the range space, the range space, the orthogonal to the UCM, that resists that kind of backcoupling, but within the UCM, it doesn't resist that kind of backcoupling. So when you combine these two types of ideas, you can actually explain all the variance data in the literature. And I didn't put the slides of these models in here. I have them in reserve if you ask questions about that later. There's actually a third mechanism that may play a role we didn't have in this original model, because in these kind of reaching movements, these are relatively fast, and it's not much time for feedback, the outer feedback loop from observing your hand reaching the target and correcting for that. But in posture, there is. And so we actually hesitated for a long time to study posture, because in posture, the story is, of course, the inverted pendulum model, that most of the posture is done by a single joint and the others are just passive. And so your sway would be all controlled by the ankle joint. And that, of course, predicts the opposite of the UCM signature, because you would say your body in space, or center of mass, or whatever it is the most variable, because if you just vary the ankle joint, then it will very effectively move the body in space around, and so most of the variance would lie in that space, and there would be very little of that funny wiggly motion that would just change the body configuration, but keep the body position or center of mass invariant space. That kind of wiggly movement, that would be consistent with the uncontrolled manifold idea. It turns out experimentally, after hesitating so long, we found exactly that. We found that no matter whether your eyes are open or closed, we have looked at all kinds of conditions. There's a huge UCM effect. You have much more of this wiggly kind of variance than the inverted pendulum kind of variance. Kind of astounding that after so many years, we found that. And that is an example where there is enough time for feedback. And that shows you sort of the third route. Let's say if your ankle joint, flexed a little bit more than it should, what then happens is that you have sensors, for instance, in your visual system or vestibular sensors and so on, that inform you about the fact that your body now accelerated forward more than expected. And those, there's a posture. So that's the low dimensional, the task space, right? It's the body in space sensor. And those sensory estimates lead to an update of the descending commands according to a control law. There's a lot of modeling been done for that. That creates muscle activations or descending activation commands to all the different degrees of freedom that would counteract that, to push the body back. And that would be, of course, be distributed across the different degrees of freedom according to the classical synergy. And by opposing that initial deviation, it essentially compensates for that initial deviation and reaches to a different configuration, realizing that same original postural, body in space position, but now different here at the level of the joint configuration. So it's another source of UCM variance. So these three mechanisms are mechanisms that account for the UCM structure of variance. So you see that this complete picture is a picture in which there is a feed-forward connectivity, but there is a lot of recurrent connectivity. This would be the outer loop, and then I previously showed the inner loop. And here in this slide, you saw these red lines, that those were the loopy things. So the back coupling is a loop. We don't know exactly through which neural substrate it goes. Could go all the way through motor cortex or somewhere earlier. And the feedback loop I showed you is going all the way, where you observe the outcome of your movement and have an update of your vision. And then within this neural network, this neural dynamics of the descending activation, that would be that network I'm just showing. And that within there are recurrent loops that effectively decouple the two subspaces. So that's really my conclusion. I'm offering to finish here and to take questions. And my conclusion is that neural process models of movement generation are dynamic in nature. And they are dynamic in nature in the sense that they autonomously generate time courses somewhere in here. They select and they make selection decisions and initiation decisions. And I argued that decisions like that entail recurrent networks that self-stabilize, that make instabilities, make one state unstable and create a new stable states. And of course, there are the reflex loops in the periphery. And this here would be just the standard stretch reflex. And the de Gruyferen problem entails loops. Now, and loops always recurrency means dynamics, right? Involve these three types of loops that I hinted at. So understanding, so process accounts for movement generation have to be dynamic in nature, neurally dynamic. And now you see the difficulty. It's much easier to just describe, some mathematical function of what something optimizes than to really figure out these kind of strongly recurrent neural networks. We're not just talking about recurrency as a small perturbation. We're talking about networks that are primarily recurrent. That's a challenge. In neurophysiology, you may realize that all our conceptual language comes from feed-forward thinking, input-output thinking. It's coding, decoding. No, coding is really just input-output. Say what input creates what output, and decoding means from the output I'm predicting what the input was. And modern techniques are about using advanced techniques to establish these kind of relationships between what's inside the nervous system, what's outside the nervous system. And that's all very well. But for the motor system, it is only a very limited tool, because in the motor system, we have activation that is not caused by something outside. It's caused inside endogenously, inside the nervous system. And so I'm hinting how one could use these instabilities and particular functional states like oscillations and decisions to try to slowly work yourself toward having a integrated process count of the nervous system, of movement generation. Okay, I'll stop sharing and try to get a sense for all the questions I missed. How do I stop sharing?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Gregor. And well, it's open first for the active participants if they have something to ask.
This is Richard Nichols here. That was really great, Gregor. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
As I've tried to point out, the spinal cord is not the repository only of the stretch reflex. And with regard to the latter part of your presentation, some of these longer loop pathways or more distributed loops are present within the spinal segment. There's something called the deep dorsal horn, where there are interneurons that receive convergent inputs from group 1A, group 2 spindle, and Golgi tendon organs.
Yeah.
And as we've known since the time of Eccles, that some of these pathways, particularly the tendon organ pathways, have wide distribution in the spinal cord. They are not autogenic, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if some of those pathways that are in the spinal cord that are actually quite rapid, they can work with latencies that are indistinguishable on a mechanical time course from the stretch reflex itself, was maybe only one or two interneurons interposed, could serve some of the stabilization functions. I thought them largely about stiffness regulation and so forth, but there may be some dynamic actions there. And we actually are starting a study with a nonlinear dynamicist at Georgia Tech to look at some of the dynamics of these pathways.
Right.
So that might be something worth considering too.
So it's clear that this was like the simplest model and sort of crude first order approximation. And in reality, we know there is a lot more complexity, including a lot of coordination already, which you're hinting at, done by this peripheral these systems. And the idea would be the more one knows about that, the more one could add that as a constraint. Different is that usually studies focus on a particular subsystem, and I'm not sure how practical it is to put all of that together in one very big model. Typically, people think of that then as weaker, has many parameters, and they have to say, well, I take the parameters from this case and apply it somewhere else. But in principle, that's the program one should pursue. And I would say conceptually, a lot of that work fits into this kind of this thinking. And that always means that the descending commands really should always be viewed in light of what that periphery, the rich patterns of coordination and feedback that the periphery offers.
Sure. I mean, every level of the nervous system is receiving feedback of some form or other. So it's very, very distributed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions, Anatol?
Okay. 2 questions. Of course, I quite agree with Gregory about timing is dynamics, but dynamics can be quite different. I can say, I can tell that most movement are result of monotonic transfer, balance and stability. Say from locomotion, it's transfer, balance and stability from one space in the environment to another spot. If take saccade, we have superior colliculus, where there is a propagation of activity along specific neural structure. So why do you think that or restrict dynamics timing to oscillation? It's why not wave or propagation process, which for me would be more basic. Even for reaching movement, you transfer balance from initial position gradually to final position. It's also implied some kind of monotonic propagation or process.
Yeah.
It's just
so I think that I think with the intuition you express with this idea of propagation is not in contradiction with what I call oscillation. In fact, when I say oscillation, it's sort of jargon. It's not really always oscillation. It is essentially self-generation of time courses, and the most relevant form is actually what is called an active transient. So that is essentially, I think, what you call propagation. So there will be some activation that propagates within a population, and it activates the inhibitory population, which ultimately stops that propagation. And it's quite possible that then the system is quiescent again. It goes back to a fixed point. Essentially, that's what the individual spiking mechanism is metaphorically, but it happens at a different level of biophysics. So when I say these models of motor cortex create oscillations, it's only under special conditions that they would really make periodic solutions. They will often just create a time course that runs its course and then stops. But the mathematics of that is that it is actually the same structure that under some conditions you can make oscillate. Now, I should maybe say, when you think through that in the motor cortex, we know that these movements are, these populations are, for one movement, are different than for the movement in the opposite direction. So it's actually not that a population that goes up and down would be a periodic movement. It would be actually a movement that keeps moving in a particular direction. So the actual pattern in motor cortex, when you would have a periodic movement, would be something where the activation, the focus of activation moves around the motor cortex, which is actually what this Churchland group is also postulating. So again, it might be misleading. It's just mathematically, it is this oscillator structure that generates these time courses, but active transient would be actually the correct term, except almost nobody knows what that is. So I don't think we really differ there. It is, I would say, it's what we're trying to do is the mathematical formalization of this kind of intuition that there would be propagation. And it's different from just thinking of some trigger that you have a sensory stimulus, and then the movement is just a passive trigger, because the time evolution is really generated within these populations. It's not from the outside. And that's why I'm talking about oscillation, because it's autonomously generated in that population.
Well, I am not implying that time is something external. It's a result of dynamic processes. This we agree, but the question for me is a form of whether it's oscillation I say you can understand locomotion as oscillation, as based on linear cycle.
It's a natural dynamic.
But for me, there is a cart and horse. Horse is pulling, and it's major process and wheels are rotating. So for me, it's monotonic process. Basic locomotion.
I can give an answer to that. You have to, if you think about that a little bit more abstractly, then you recognize there are really only two things. So, for instance, if you have posture, you have a fixed point in some sense, some state space. If you have a movement, like a horse and a cart, right? That can be also a posture. It's just posture in velocity space. If you have a constant velocity, that can be considered mathematically to be a fixed point. It's just a fixed point in velocity. So, for instance, we're modeling heading direction when you move, heading direction as being in an attractor, and that heading direction is essentially the velocity, the angular aspect of velocity. Now, that's a fixed point. But when you get something that changes, so when you get something that's, just a moment, when you get something that changes from moving to non-moving, or moving and back, then it can no longer be captured by a fixed point attractor. And the next dynamical object that exists generally is an oscillator. So you have fixed points, and then you have limit cycles, and then you have chaotic attractors. That's essentially all that exists as qualitatively different stable solutions in dynamic systems. And that's why we call it oscillator, because what happens is that you need, for a brief moment in time, a dynamical system that has an oscillatory state. And that oscillatory state then, again, disappears and yields to another fixed point at the end of the movement. But in between, dynamically speaking, it's an oscillator. So that's a more abstract way of talking, I think, about what also your intuition is like. I realized that a lot of questions.
I had second question, okay? I had a second question. Okay. So you try to solve inverse dynamic problem based, say, on EMG to find out how lambda changed, okay? If I understood correctly, okay?
Yeah.
For me, it's because of fundamental non-linearity, the problem cannot be solved. Whereas experimental ways finding, say, how equilibrium shift, and you don't need to simulate. For me, even if I simulated, say, tri-burst pattern, I don't care about this tri-burst pattern. But for you, did you try, say, you found change in lambda? Did you try take realistic property of motor neurons, muscles, and anatomy to see what you reproduce real kinematic and electromyographic patterns?
I think Gregor showed it. Gregor started by showing us that the kinematic patterns are well reproduced.
I don't see good reproduction, even kinematic, not to mention EMG patterns, based on N-shaped arc amount.
So I didn't show all the examples, but no, we test that. Yes, the estimated, we have these different methods of estimation, and the estimated descending activation patterns actually do predict the movement correctly. You're right; it cannot be estimated under all conditions. Now, only under certain conditions can you actually estimate. mean, this is never perfect. I mean, we use this crude model, it would be, so there are limitations to this, quantitative limitations, but it's not like there's a magic trick that somehow if you just make one little quantitative change, then suddenly all the complexity goes away. That is certainly not true. So we see that the descending activation patterns have to have particular, they are specific. They have to have particular time shapes to get the movement right. And if you can't just take, let's say, the descending activation pattern and warp it in time, just make it faster or slower, then you don't get realistic movements. As you make the movement faster, you have to give it a particular temporal shape. So that really means that somewhere in the central nervous system, there need to be these circuits, probably learned through cerebellar loop and so on, that a lot of these adaptation studies are about, in generating the right time courses of the descending activation patterns to get the movement right? And we know from disease and from the initial phase of learning that it isn't actually easy to do that. And so we have only captured a very simple case like that. So what we're trying to say is to say, yes, that is also true, but how does the periphery interface? And I would say, well, we see it interfaces because the fact that there's this reflex periphery really modifies what the descending commands have to do. And they don't specify the torque profiles alone, for instance, but they also do. I mean, they also modulate the torque generation.
Right, Marco, I think you had a question.
Yeah, quick question. Thank you, Gregor, for the nice talk. I find the connection between motor neurons that you hypothesized as a potential mechanism for the UCM synergy an interesting thought. I was just wondering, and the same, for the backcoupling is also a very interesting consideration that would account for this overarching model. For the connection among motor neurons, whereby activity could be kind of regulated, not monitored, but self-corrected, so to speak. Is there any physiological evidence that we have something that would resemble such a network? Because I'm just thinking about the multitude of inputs. Richard Nichols mentioned the bombardment, so to speak, of inputs from sensory afferents. And it is indeed extremely complicated as a network by itself. So I wonder, for such a network to
I must say that I used in this diagram, I said, oh, these would be motor neurons, but actually the model is more abstract. The model takes a end effector level timing signal, distributes that to essentially muscle descending activations to the individual muscles and couples these activations. And we don't know if those are, for instance, if that's really coupling between spinal motor neurons, or is that happening somewhere in the motor cortex, actually, where descending commands are, mutually, multiple commands, high-dimensional space, are coupled. We don't know that. And the most likely, as usual, is probably it's everywhere. As what Richard just hinted at, that there's a lot of spinal circuitry that already is intricately connected to function that could make a contribution. And we know that in motor cortex, for instance, if you learn a force field, that you in motor cortex have neurons that are tuned to the expected direction of a force, that reflects also that there is some task-specific tuning that could very well involve such coupling as well. It seems a really challenging task to figure that out. I mean, I don't even know. I don't think I know of a single example in neurophysiology where one has solved that kind of problem, having a strongly recurrent neural network and understanding its coupling structure.
Well, Gregor, I think at the level of motor neurons, we have recurrent inhibition, which is also the Renshaw cell projections are controlled from the brain, so the gain. So basically, you can tune it so that within a muscle, you have effects that are similar to what Gregor showed schematically with these mutually inhibiting elements. well, recurrent inhibition seems to be doing exactly that. Then straight reflex and most other reflexes are kind of negative feedbacks. So, and they're also modulated from supraspinal structures. Yeah. So they can also be more or less stabilizing some sort of behavior. So I would say that at a spinal level, there are at least few documented schemes that can do the trick.
Yeah, an argument that it could be partly in the periphery is that it is actually not so easy to learn. So for instance, if you think that you can adapt to a complex force field within, let's say, 150 trials to compensate for a force field, you cannot actually just learn a new UCM not even in a week. Famously with John Schultz, we tried very hard to get people to learn totally, for instance, multiple joints animating a computer cursor that would not correspond to any spatial position on your joint. And it was pretty much impossible for people to learn that. There are some reports, Musa Evaldi had this with his hand gestures, but I actually think that they tapped into synergies, and this would be something that Marco would know that I think
we did actually one experiment, Gregor, where we asked people to learn a very unusual pattern. Well, it was an asymmetric multi-finger task when we asked them to produce force, which was the sum of these four-finger forces, asymmetrical, this and that, minus the sum of other four-finger forces, which were unintentionally, of course, involved by enslaving. It took 2 days, and they started with no UCM signature whatsoever. And they ended up with their UCM signature. So it's probably task specific.
And I actually think of the fingers as being, that is actually sort of a mix between end effector and degree freedom, because you do have actually tasks with the fingers, like piano playing and so on. While the muscles within your basic effectors might be much more rigidly combined, and that might reflect something that's spinal or is at least lower in the nervous system. And that sort of hints at the distributed nature of this, and that there are some low-level things that are somewhat rigid, and then there are some modulation you can do on top. So a neural reduction to really say it's this circuit that does that seems really challenging to me. So we're trying to find out the principles and correlate that with some neural signatures, but I don't think we can expect to pinpoint exactly the neural circuitry that does that.
Thank you.
Okay, Jeroen?
I have a question not about periphery, but about visual input. In your way of describing, you start with visual input and then the time course follows from that. And that looks like a kind of reaction time. But as I showed also in my lecture, you can also update your movement or adjust your movement at a much shorter latency. So is that in a way a direct consequence of the dynamics in that sensory layer, or so that if you have a target and that shifts a little bit, that you can follow that shift much quicker than if you have a new one and you have to redecide?
Exactly, yes. Actually, we modeled that. We did online updating. And essentially, if you think of this, the movement program in the old sense, the movement parameter representation is like a peak of activation in a population like that. Then the peak can track input, so it can be shifted. It still takes time, and there's this delay about 100 milliseconds, for that updating to occur. But it can track it, and it is, in a sense, easier to track than to get the peak up, especially against competing peaks, to get the peak up from zero. So that's a real dissociation. So the question, does this, I'm sure this happens at the level of movement parameters. So there are two stages, I kind of hand-waved about that. There is movement parameters which are already in this reference frame that's sent in your hand. And these are these invariant things like direction, amplitude, maybe force level, versus the scene, right? If you have in the scene, you have objects, you make a selection that is centered in the visual array. And both are probably able to make selection decisions. You might just select an object, or you might also make a selection later. And online updating clearly affects movement parameters. Does it also, for instance, would you make a different selection? We know that you can update, for instance, if you get a command that says you go to the red target, and then they say, but when the color changes, then go to the other target. And that takes longer to update, like 300 milliseconds. And that could be that other level, that may be the scene level. But I don't know that really. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, a lot of room for maneuver for other processes. This problem of this integrative work, right? A lot of things can contribute to these.
Okay, and one more question from Richard Van Emmerik, and then there is a burning question of intentional and unintentional movements that you haven't addressed. But first, Richard.
All right, thanks, Gregor. That was very impressive overview of neurodynamics. My question is pretty specific. I was intrigued by your findings of the UCM application to standing posture and yes, arguing against still the kind of predominant inverted pendulum model. I would ask, can you say a little bit more about that? Under what conditions was that the case, both under regular unconstrained standing versus, say, perturbation experiments? Or
So this is a very robust finding. It means it's kind of astounding that in hindsight it's very robust. So it's no conditions where it doesn't occur. I would say the subtlety about that is that you could say in some subtle sense it is consistent with the inverse pendulum hypothesis functionally, but it is the opposite mechanically. So let me clarify that. So it's the opposite of inverted pendulum in the sense that if you look at the individual joints in posture, actually all the joints, and the same is for muscles, they are all active. Actually, look at the variance of hip joint, knee joint. There's similar order of magnitudes. The ankle is no way special. All these joints are active. And they have this covariation structure that most of their covariation is in this direction of mostly preferring these internal movements. So in that sense, inverted pendulum approximation is not a good description of the kinematics of movement. But on the other hand, the inverse pendulum idea is really about the postural control mechanism only needing to know about body in space, one thing. And the naive idea about inverted pendulum is that it would send that then to the ankle. That isn't right. It sends that to everyone. But it really converges on this body in space. And you could say that this UCM signature is consistent with that, because what it says is that the variance is organized so that that it sort of separates the variance in space, body in space, from that other variance. And we can do that other variance, in a sense, in its movement generation system, and it doesn't need the outer feedback loop to control that other variance. And so in that sense, it is, for the sensory consequences, it's still compatible with inverse pendulum in the sense you have a bottleneck, which is body in space, and that is what the sensors pick up. So you could just replace in these models, like if you take the Kundring model, or not Van der Kooi model, or any of those models, or the models of in John Jacobs' lab, and you just replace the motor system by a multi-degree freedom motor system, then it's still the same feedback loop. And the Hendrik Reimann's model, the one that I referenced, that was published last year, or 2 years ago maybe, that actually does that. That takes the typical feedback loop models and just inserts this high-dimensional system. And then, the typical things like entrainment to visual motion, for instance, and all of these things, they are consistent with that.
Thanks.
So, Gregor, what's different between intentional and unintentional movements?
Did I say that? I don't know what unintentional movement is in general.
No, it's in the questions.
Okay.
It's not my question. It's in the chat.
Yeah. So, I was talking about movements that are directed at objects, and they are intentional in the two senses. There is this sense of intention that's intuitive, that you have some, motor intention that it's voluntary, but it's also intentional in being about the world. Achieving some state in the world, and there could be unintentional movements in the sense, there could be automatic or reflex-like where you don't set a goal for the movement. But I really just meant, for instance, if you wave, it is not object-oriented, but you're still trying to achieve something in the world, like your hand is doing something specific. So in that respect, unintentional doesn't seem a very specific category. Maybe I introduced this confusion in talking about intentional movement. Or is there something more specific about that? Maybe, I think, wasn't it Daniela?
No, there was nothing more specific about it. Okay. But you better take a look through a few more questions that emerged and see whether you want to address any of those, because we're way past the time.
Okay.
And at some point...
So maybe I'll go backwards, because the first question I might have answered... So if I base this on the questions in the chat, right? If somebody translated that into the chat, then I have this question by Giovanni Milandri.
Anatol wanted to say something about that last thing.
Mindy, let's wait for...
Intentional and...
cannot do two things at the same time, so let's wait.
Okay. So Giovanni Milandri asks... that would handle tactile information, selection, attention as well. No, you mentioned at the high level, there's vision, attention, but why can't we just use attention point or attention size scope as a reference trajectory from Feldman that would handle tactile information and so on as well? Well, I would say, I don't think I understand that fully, but I would say there is an idea that there would be a spatial representation, for instance, a target you want to move to. That could also be, where you could just think of a location you want to go, and that would then feed into that entire system that I was talking about. So if you think of this big hierarchy, that would be maybe your scene representation. And I think what you're hinting at, Giovanni, is that there could be, one could imagine that you're just setting yourself a spatial goal, but there doesn't have to be an object there. It could be just something that you select. Maybe you could select it even through tactile or other kinds of information. And then you send the motor command to go there. And that sounds like Anatol's way of thinking about the reference configuration or reference trajectory that says, I want to be there somewhere, and that's how I can move there. And I would say, yes, in principle, that is consistent with that it's quite possible that you can make a movement into empty space, right? And in empty space, you would be setting yourself a goal like that. That's quite possible. What I'm claiming is that for a certain class of movements, that always entails this entire chain of timing, initiation, termination, which I didn't talk so much about, and then all this control stuff at the bottom. That is, for instance, you can see that makes a difference if you make this movement slowly or you make it fast, right? And you can time that movement, even a wavy movement. I can time it to a metronome or to some inner timer, and therefore controlled time. So it's not enough to just say I'm arguing against this quasi-postural picture to say I'm just shifting my posture to a new thing. It's like this. That is maybe a description of some slow movements that are just postural shifts. But a lot of movement is not like that. It really has a time course that is reproducible, coordinated, and that then solves all the dynamic problems, physical dynamics of counteracting the forces that arise as you do that. Okay, there's another question by Daniela. The passage from a classical paper from Michael Fox, the human brain is intrinsically organized in dynamic anti-correlated function networks. Sorry, no, that's a comment for a first question. No, I'm sorry, I'm skipping here one. So Emiko Ushiyama says, thank you Sorry, it's just not a question. So
there is a question about brain literalization.
Brain literalization.
Also from Daniela.
Brain 10. Literalization on the descending activation. I don't really know anything specific about that, I have to say. I mean, it's not like in localizing. So what we do when we postulate these function models, and we formulate these models in neural language. We say, it's not information processing. It can't just take some vector and return something else. It's always got to be an activation pattern in neural networks. So it's neural in that sense. As I hinted, it uses this language. But do we know how it is mapped onto the brain? We also only know it descriptively. That is, we look for certain properties of neurons in certain populations, and then we say, well, those are candidates for the neural network. Now, if we had a complete mapping of all connectivities in the brain, we could try to find the subnetwork that does this. But the way we do that is essentially use characterizations of neurons in terms of their output connectivity or their input connectivity, their involvement, neuropsychology when there are disturbances, and then say, well, these are candidates for the kind of neural circuits that we postulate. So with respect to lateralization, we cannot say anything other than those people who study that is, that we know, but the contralateral organization and so on. But it's nothing, we have nothing original to say about that, unfortunately.
Okay, so, but we will have Tuesday, we will have next Tuesday a whole week. So I'm encouraging everybody to prepare questions for anybody, including Gregor, of course. Okay. But as of now, I, of course, have my traditional shot. So, Gregor, to your health, cheers. Thank you very much for the talk.
Everybody. Thank you. Thanks for the questions.
Very nice. Okay. All right. So, everybody, thank you all very much. And I hope to see you on Saturday, same time.
Okay.
I will send you the new link. Probably it's going to be a new one. I don't know. Maybe this one will work. I have no idea because I put it only for Tuesday. But it may work. But well, whatever. I'll do something. Okay. If you don't receive anything, just try this link that you used today. So, ciao.
Ciao. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Thank you, Gregor. See you all.
See you all.
Adios.
Have a nice week.
Yeah, you too.
Okay, as you have heard, Mark telling that next Saturday will be our last presentation, but we are not going to end by that time because we decided to have the ending session, and for the ending session all the invited speakers will be again, and they'll be available to answer your supreme questions. I mean, the idea is do open-ended questions, so they are not going to say yes or no as answer, but they will try to figure out a nice answer. Okay, so you have a whole week to think about your intriguing question or your keening question about your research project, about your research, about your doubts, about anything. So you have two options to do to send us the questions. You can send the question to our email, Virtual Motor Control Summer School 2020 @gmail.com, or you can post your question on Facebook on our page, and we are going to collect all the questions and show to all the you can do two different things. You can send a general question to all the invited speakers, or you can choose one of the invited speakers to answer your question. Okay, and if you send me with I will try to send the questions previously to the speaker, so they will have time to figure out or to enrich their answer. And also probably the invited speaker, they're gonna make questions to the other ones. So it's gonna be a very nice session to end this first Virtual Motor Control Summer School. But we'll be we have a red set for the second Virtual Motor Control Summer School. It will start on June. Okay, and we have already Richard Nichols, Richard Van Emmerich, Monica, and the other one I forgot, but we have 4 or 5 that have already accepted to present. So, and then we're gonna have a break to have some weekends, but in June we'll be back. Okay, thank you for your time staying with us. Stay safe, have a nice week. See all of you this Saturday. Okay, bye bye.